My father slammed a crumpled piece of paper onto the kitchen table so hard the salt shaker rattled. It was an invoice for $250,000, labeled server maintenance. He pointed a grease-stained finger in my face and screamed that I was a gambling addict, dragging this family into the gutter with my fake computer games. He told me to get out before I infected them with my failure. I didn't say a word. I just looked down at my phone, where a notification had just popped up. Trading algorithm liquidity event complete. Net profit $34.5 million. I picked up my bag and walked out into the cold. Before I tell you what happened when the gambler he kicked out became the owner of his entire livelihood, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to see how far this story travels. I shoved clothes into my duffel bag with the precision of a machine. 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, my laptop. That was the only asset that mattered. I didn't look at the photos on the dresser. They were depreciated inventory now. The front door opened, bringing in a gust of freezing wind and the sharp, chemical smell of antiseptic. Sloane walked in, her blue scrubs wrinkled and stained with something dark near the hem. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired my father respected because he could see it. Thomas turned to her, his face softening instantly. He went from a man on the edge of violence to a doting patriarch in less than a second. "There she is," he said, his voice thick with pride. "Look at those hands. Honest dirt. That's what saving lives looks like." He turned back to me, the disgust returning to his eyes like a physical weight. "Take a look, Skylar. That is real work. That is dignity. Not sitting in a dark room, pressing buttons and pretending it matters." I stood there, bag in hand, watching them. In the past, this was the part where I would cry. I would beg him to understand that writing code wasn't playing, that managing risk for $1 billion portfolio was harder than he could imagine. But tonight, my pulse didn't even spike. I felt a cold, metallic calm wash over me. The same sensation I got when the market crashed and I had 3 seconds to hedge a position. It wasn't just that he was mean, it was that he was afraid. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see a monster. I saw a man terrified of his own obsolescence. To Thomas, value had to be heavy, it had to sweat, it had to hurt. If he couldn't touch it, if he couldn't weigh it on a scale, it wasn't real. My invisible millions didn't just confuse him, they insulted him. They suggested that 40 years of breaking his back in a steel mill might not have been the only way to survive. His cruelty wasn't discipline, it was a defense mechanism. He had to believe I was a failure, because if I wasn't, then his entire worldview that suffering is the only currency of worth was a lie. He wasn't evicting a daughter, he was evicting the anomaly that threatened his reality. "I'm disappointed in you, Skylar," Sloane said, her voice dripping with that practiced, golden child pity. "Dad works so hard. The least you could do is get a job that pays the bills, instead of whatever this is." I didn't argue. I didn't pull up my bank app. Arguing with them was like trying to explain calculus to a brick wall, a waste of energy with zero return on investment. "You're right," I said, my voice flat. "I'm done pretending." I walked past them. I didn't look back at the kitchen, where I'd eaten thousands of meals, or the living room, where I'd learned to be invisible. I stepped out into the night. The air was biting, but it felt clean. Behind me, I heard the deadbolt slide home. It sounded like the final stamp on a closed contract. I got into my car, the leather seats freezing against my legs. I didn't turn on the heat. I just sat there for a moment, watching the porch light flicker and die. He'd turned it off. He wanted me to know I was gone. I put the car in gear. I wasn't homeless. I was just finally checking into my real life. The drive from Gary to Chicago is less than 30 miles, but it spans 2 different centuries. I watched the rearview mirror as the rusted skeletons of the steel mills faded into the gray horizon. That was Thomas's world, a world of physical weight, of things you could hit with a hammer, of soot and sweat. It was a world that was dying, inch by painful inch, and he was determined to die with it. Ahead of me, the skyline of the loop rose up like a jagged graph of pure efficiency. Glass, steel, and light. This was my world. A world of invisible leverage, where value wasn't dug out of the ground, but architected in the cloud. I pulled my beat-up sedan into the private underground garage of the Street Regis. The valet, a man named Marcus who had known me for 3 years, opened the door before I even cut the engine. He didn't look at the dented bumper or the duffel bag on the passenger seat. He just nodded and said, "Welcome home, Miss Schuyler." That simple phrase hit me harder than my father's shouting. Home. I took the private elevator to the 65th floor. When the doors slid open, the silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind I'd grown up with, the kind that meant Dad was in a mood and we had to walk on eggshells. This was the silence of a vacuum. It was pristine. It was expensive. I dropped my bag on the Italian marble floor and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below me, the city was a grid of golden electricity. I could see everything from up here. I could see the flow of capital, the movement of logistics, the heartbeat of an economy that my father swore didn't exist. For years, people have asked me why I did it. Why did I live in that drafty house with the leaking roof? Why did I let Sloane borrow money I knew she'd never pay back? Why did I let Thomas lecture me about fiscal responsibility while I was managing a liquidity pool larger than the GDP of a small country? It wasn't because I was weak. It was because I was running a test. I call it the invisible chain of the survivor. When you grow up being told you're a burden, you develop a desperate, pathetic hope that one day you will be enough just by existing. I didn't want to buy their love. I knew that if I showed them my bank account, Thomas would suddenly be proud. Sloane would suddenly be my best friend. But they wouldn't be loving me. They would be loving the access. They would be loving the ATM. I stayed in the cage because I wanted them to open the door, not because I couldn't pick the lock. I wanted one moment, just one, where my father looked at me with pride, simply because I was his daughter, not because I could buy him a new truck. I wanted Sloane to defend me because I was her sister, not because I paid her rent. I held on to that secret wealth like a breath I was afraid to let go of, waiting for the right moment to exhale. Tonight, the test had finally concluded. The data was in. The results were conclusive. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. I wasn't the disappointment. I wasn't the gambler. I was the architect of a fortress they couldn't even comprehend. The invisible chain had snapped the moment he turned off that porch light. He thought he was casting me out into the wilderness. He didn't realize he was just releasing me back into my natural habitat. I turned away from the window. The apartment was cold, but it was mine. Every square inch of limestone and leather was paid for with the very fake computer games he despised. I wasn't waiting for permission to exist anymore. I walked into the kitchen, a sleek, white, minimalist space that had never seen a family dinner, and opened my laptop. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the room with the blue light of the markets. The numbers were still dancing. The algorithm was still hunting. I wasn't just safe, I was weaponized. And for the first time in 29 years, I didn't have to apologize for it. My office isn't a room, it's a cockpit. 3 curved monitors dominate the desk, glowing with the heartbeat of the global markets. To the left, the Asian exchanges are waking up. To the right, the European futures are flashing red and green. This is where I live. This is where I breathe. The air conditioning hums with a sterile, expensive quiet that smells like ozone and potential. I sat down in my Aran chair, the mesh adjusting to my posture instantly. I typed in my encryption key, and the screens flooded with data. My portfolio was up another 1.2% since I left Gary. In the time it took Thomas to scream at me for being useless, I had made more money than he would see in 3 lifetimes. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It vibrated against the wood like an angry insect. I knew who it was before I looked. It wasn't a client. Clients emailed. It wasn't a bank. Banks sent secure notifications. It was the past, trying to claw its way back into the present. I picked it up. A text from Sloane. "You broke Dad's heart, Sky. He's sitting at the kitchen table crying. He's worried sick you're going to end up in a ditch somewhere because you're so unstable. We can't sleep thinking about you. Also, his blood pressure meds are due tomorrow, and the copay is $500. Send it to my Venmo if you want to come home. Don't be selfish." I stared at the screen. I read it twice, analyzing the syntax like a line of buggy code. The structure was impressive in its toxicity. First, the guilt hook, "You broke his heart." Second, the fear tactic, "You're unstable, in a ditch." Third, the gaslighting. "We're the victims. And finally, the ask. The inevitable, transactional punchline. Send cash. They had kicked me out 3 hours ago. They had thrown me into sub-zero temperatures without a coat. And now, they were worried I was in a ditch, not because they wanted to save me, but because they needed to know if my wallet had survived the fall. It wasn't love. It was an invoice for a service I had been providing for free since I was 16. I was the emotional janitor and the financial safety net. And they were angry that the equipment had walked off the job. I didn't feel sad. Sadness implies a loss of value. This was just a clarification of terms. They didn't miss me. They missed the subsidy. I didn't reply. Engaging with Sloane was like feeding a volatility spike, it only increased the noise. I swiped left and deleted the thread. I didn't block her number. A good trader never cuts off a data feed, even if the data is garbage. You watch it, you learn from it. I turned back to my monitors. The anger in my chest tightened, condensing into a cold, hard knot of focus. Thomas thought he had leverage because he was the father. He thought he held the deed to my self-worth, but he didn't understand the market we were playing in. He was operating on a legacy system, sentimental, physical, slow. I was operating on high-frequency logic. I opened a secure terminal window and typed in a new command, Project Ironclad. It was a file I'd been building for 6 months. A comprehensive diligence report on a distressed asset in northwest Indiana, a steel manufacturing plant with failing credit, pension liabilities exceeding its cap, and a management team looking for a golden parachute. Midwest Steel. I looked at the financials. They were bleeding out. They had 3 weeks of operating cash left before they missed payroll. Before the pension fund, Thomas's pension fund evaporated into the ether. Thomas wanted me to pay for his blood pressure meds? Fine. I would do better than that. I wouldn't just pay the bill, I would buy the pharmacy. I hit execute on the preliminary inquiry to my legal team. The email sent with a soft whoosh. I'm not coming home, Sloane, I whispered to the empty, perfect room. I'm buying the house. Samantha sat at the head of the conference table, a file folder thick with red ink resting between us. She wasn't just my attorney. She was the only person in Chicago who knew the full architecture of my life. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with the sharp, assessing gaze of a general reviewing a battle plan. It's worse than the initial diligence suggested, she said, sliding the folder toward me. Midwest Steel isn't just bleeding cash, Skylar. It's clinically dead. They've been cooking the books for 3 quarters to hide the pension shortfall. If they declare Chapter 11, the workers get nothing. No severance, no retirement, just a padlock on the gate. I opened the file. The numbers screamed at me. Liabilities exceeding assets by a factor of 3. A management team that had been stripping copper out of the walls while promising the union everything was fine. This was Thomas's world. The real work he worshipped. It was a rotting carcass held together by lies and debt. He woke up every morning at 4 a.m., put on his steel-toed boots, and marched into a building that was already a tomb. He believed in the company because he could touch the machinery. He didn't understand that the invisible math had already killed it. If we don't intervene, Samantha continued, tapping a line on the spreadsheet, they miss payroll in 14 days. Your father loses his job, his health insurance, and 30 years of pension contributions. He'll be destitute by the end of the month. I looked at the projection. It was a mathematical inevitability. Thomas had called me a gambling addict. He had sneered at my fake numbers. And yet, here I was, the only person in the room, the only person in the world, with the capital and the calculus to stop the bleeding. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a lottery ticket. I had spent 10 years sharpening my mind into a weapon. I had taught myself Python at night while he slept. I had studied market microstructure while he watched football. I had endured the ridicule of being the weird girl with the laptop because I saw a future he was too stubborn to imagine. My wealth was the direct result of the intellect he despised. I wasn't the underdog because I was weak. I was the underdog because they refused to look up and see the giant standing next to them. The acquisition price? I asked. $80 million for the debt assumption and operating capital, Samantha said. It's a heavy lift, Sky. Why do this? He threw you out. He humiliated you. Let him fail. Let him see what his honest dirt is worth when the gates are locked. I stood up and walked to the window. The city below was a grid of logic and light. If I let him fail, I said, he becomes a martyr. He'll spend the rest of his life blaming the economy, the government, the system. He'll never understand that he was wrong. He'll never understand that the daughter he called useless was the only reason he had a roof over his head. I turned back to her. I don't want to save him, Sam. I want to own the narrative. I want him to clock in every morning knowing that the lights are on because of my code. I want him to cash his pension check knowing it was signed by my hand. I want to buy the very thing he values most in the world, so he can never, ever tell me again that I don't contribute. I sat back down and pulled the signature page toward me. I didn't hesitate. I didn't tremble. I picked up my pen. Execute the buyout, I said. Full acquisition. Keep my name off the press release for 48 hours. I want the ink dry before he knows who signed the check. I signed my name. The loops of the S and the K looked sharp, like barbed wire. And Sam? I added, handing the document back. Make sure the deed is physical. I want the paper. I want to be able to put it on a table and make a sound. Samantha smiled, a shark-like grin of approval. Project, Ironclad, is live. I walked out of the boardroom. I had just spent $80 million to prove a point, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I was worth. 2 weeks later, the algorithm executed the final trade. The wire transfer cleared at 9 a.m., moving $80 million of liquidity from a holding company in Delaware to a receiver in Indiana. The ink was dry. The deed was recorded. I was sitting in my office, watching the live feed from Bloomberg News on the center monitor. The anchor, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a voice like a scalpel, was introducing the segment, "The Phantom Quant of Chicago," she called me. The invisible hand that just saved Midwest Steel. My face filled the screen. It was a pre-recorded interview I'd done the day before. I looked calm, professional, and terrifyingly competent. The chyron beneath my name read, "Schuyler, last name, CEO of Ethelgard Capital, acquires Midwest Steel." 30 miles away, in a kitchen that smelled of bacon grease and anxiety, Thomas was watching. I know he was watching because Sloan told me later. He dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum, a ceramic casualty of a paradigm shift he wasn't equipped to handle. He didn't call to congratulate me. He didn't text to say he was proud. He got in his truck. 90 minutes later, my assistant buzzed me. "There are 2 people here to see you, Miss Schuyler. A Thomas and a Sloan. Security wants to know if they should call the police." "No," I said, my voice steady. "Send them to the boardroom, the glass one. I wanted transparency. I wanted them to see exactly where they were standing." I walked into the boardroom 5 minutes later. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the city I had conquered. Thomas and Sloan were standing by the window, looking out of place in their flannel and denim against the Italian leather chairs. When Thomas turned to face me, his face wasn't filled with awe. It was twisted into a rictus of pure, unadulterated rage. "You liar!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the hard surfaces. "You vicious, manipulative liar. You let us think you were a bum. You let us think you were nothing." He slammed his hand on the marble table. $17 million a year? $80 million for the plant? You made a fool out of me. You made me look like an idiot in front of my own family. I didn't flinch. I didn't yell back. I just watched him unravel. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. It's what happens when a deeply held belief is slammed headfirst into an undeniable reality. Thomas believed 2 things with absolute certainty. 1, that he was the superior provider, and 2, that I was a worthless burden. The evidence in front of him, the office, the news, the money, proved that both those things were lies. But the human ego is a fragile thing. Rather than accepting he was wrong, rather than feeling the shame of his cruelty, his brain rejected the data. He couldn't process the guilt, so he transmuted it into anger. He wasn't crying because he was sorry. He was screaming because his reality was breaking apart, and he hated me for being the hammer. "Are you done?" I asked, my voice cutting through his shouting like a cold wind. "I'm not done," he roared. You think you can just buy us? You think money fixes what you are? You're still the girl who couldn't handle real work. I walked to the table. I was carrying a single manila folder. I placed it gently on the marble. It made a soft thud that silenced the room. I didn't buy you, Dad, I said. I bought the debt you couldn't pay. I slid the folder across the table. He looked at it, his chest heaving. He opened it. It wasn't a check, it was a deed. The deed to Midwest Steel. The deed to the land, the machinery, the pension fund, and the very gate he walked through every morning. I own the mortgage on the plant, I said. I own the equipment you operate. I own the pension fund that you were terrified was going to vanish. I didn't gamble away my life. I capitalized yours. Thomas stared at the paper. His hand started to shake. The red flush drained from his face, leaving him gray and ashen. He looked at the signature line. My name, the same name he'd told to get out of his house. He looked up at me, and for the first time, the anger was gone. It was replaced by a hollow, devastating fear. He realized that the power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. He wasn't the father anymore. He was a line item on my balance sheet. You own my job? He whispered. I own the company, I corrected. Which means I decide who has a job. Sloane made a small, choked sound in the corner. She looked between us, her golden child status evaporating in the face of absolute leverage. Why? Thomas asked, his voice cracking. Why would you do this? Because you told me to go live on the streets, I said. And I decided I'd rather own the pavement. Sloane was the first to recover. The shock on her face smoothed out, replaced by a calculating, hungry look I recognized from childhood. It was the look she wore when she realized I had money for the ice cream truck and she didn't. So, she said, her voice trembling with a sudden, desperate hope. You own the company. That means we're rich, right? I mean, we're family. We can all finally breathe. She took a step toward me, reaching out a hand as if the last 3 hours, the eviction, the insults, the text demanding cash had just been a misunderstanding. She thought the deed on the table was a lottery ticket she had partially purchased by sharing my DNA. I looked at her hand. I didn't take it. No, Sloane, I said. I am rich. You are employees. Thomas flinched. The distinction hit him like a physical blow. The pension fund is fully capitalized, I continued, my voice echoing in the glass room. You will keep your jobs, not because you're my father, but because the shift supervisors tell me you're a competent foreman. You will receive your paycheck every 2 weeks. You will retire with dignity. But that is where the transaction ends. I stood up. The meeting was over. I am not your daughter anymore, I said, looking Thomas in the eye. I am your employer. And I don't mix family with business. I pressed the intercom button. Security, please escort my guests to the elevator. They didn't argue. The fight had been bought out. They walked out of the boardroom in silence, 2 small figures moving through a world of glass and steel they would never truly inhabit. I walked to the window and watched them emerge onto the street far below. They looked like ants, insignificant, manageable. 6 months later, I stood on a stage at a STEM summit for young women in Detroit. The room was packed with girls in hoodies and combat boots, girls who looked exactly like I did at 16, angry, brilliant, and ignored. I didn't tell them about the eviction. I didn't mention the text messages or the glass room. I talked about the justice of the sower. People tell you that revenge is a fire, I told them. They say you should burn down the bridges of the people who hurt you. But fire is messy. Fire leaves you with nothing but ash. I paused, looking at the faces in the front row. True revenge isn't destruction. It's construction. It's building a fortress so high and so strong that the people who doubted you can't even see over the walls. It's sowing seeds in the ground they told you was barren. I didn't destroy my father. I saved him. And every time he cashes a check, every time he clocks in, he has to live with the fact that the failure he threw away is the only reason he's standing. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a sovereign nation. Don't burn them, I said. Outgrow them. That night, I approved the first round of grants for the Ironclad Scholarship Fund, Full rides for 50 kids from the Rust Belt who wanted to learn code. I was building an army of architects. I closed my laptop. The city lights were bright, but my apartment was quiet. It was the silence of peace, the silence of a ledger that finally balanced. If you had to choose between fighting for approval from people who doubt you, or fighting for a future where they can't touch you, which would you pick? Let me know in the comments.